Good afternoon. On behalf of ISAS and on behalf of all of us gathered here, I have great pleasure in welcoming Professor Ruth Kattumuri of LSE. She is Professor at LSE, Co-Director of the India Observatory, and an Associate at the Grantham Research Institute for Climate and the Environment, Climate Change and the Environment. She is, comes with impressive scholarship and research credentials, has done research in growth, inclusion, sustainable development, has engaged in a variety of micro-level transdisciplinary issues arising from policy engagement. And she's been voted the best teacher in LSE for several years in a row. And I know for a fact that she's been a social entrepreneur, started several development programs in developing countries, including, as I know, I've known her for over a decade now, when I was in the government and in the Reserve Bank. She has been so entrepreneurial as to raise funds and research grant for the India Foundation at LSE, India Observatory. Ruth, ISAS, the Institute for South Asian Studies, is an institute engaged in studying contemporary political, economic, and strategic issues in countries of South Asia, so that we have a better understanding and can influence public policy at the country and regional level. And many of the people you see here are researchers at ISAS, but there are a few who are from outside ISAS as well. Professor Kattumuri is going to talk about skills and development challenges for South Asia. We've done some work here in ISAS. Dipinda leads that work on skills. And the problem of skills is a problem for every country, for the world as a whole. It's just not a problem, actually, from speaking for India, I would say it's a crisis. Because in India, we want to produce 100 million tons of steel. We can't get a crane operator. India produces 350,000 engineers every year, not more than 75,000 are employable. India has 7,500 ITIs, and most of the ITI graduates are as hopelessly skilled when they come out as they were when they entered. So in India, I know, is grappling with this problem of skills, and that's a very difficult challenge because the private sector will not invest in skills because it's a merit good, and people who, if they train somebody, that they cannot appropriate the benefits because that person can run away with the skills, other people will poach him. The government cannot invest in skills because it is inappropriately structured. So the best way of, no, not at all, please welcome. The best way of imparting skills is public-private partnership, but that again is a big challenge. But if you move away from the country level, look at the global level, in my view there are three big forces which are causing rethink on skill development. The first is globalization. The old theory used to be that as low-skilled jobs go away from rich countries to poor countries, rich countries will move up the value chain and create a job at the higher end. But for some reason, that's not happened. There are certainly gains from trade between rich and poor countries. The gains are distributed, whereas the costs are concentrated among a few people. America certainly has lost jobs to China because of globalization. And to what extent can this loss of jobs from America to China, for example, be managed by reskilling? So globalization, although I've referred to China and America, globalization is one big force altering the skill landscape. The second is technology. And there is research which shows that artificial intelligence and robotics are already taking away jobs. there are one machine can take away as many as 6 jobs for every 1,000 workers. And it's scary to think about this because we're only at the beginning of the AI revolution. As this deepens, we don't know what's going to happen. There are technology optimists who say that this fear about AI and the robotics is exaggerated. The world met the challenge of joblessness or job loss in the first industrial revolution, that as machines replaced people, people found more productive jobs to do. But as opposed to that are the techno-pessimists who say that the artificial intelligence that's coming now is a totally different animal, something unlike the Industrial Revolution, and that it's hollowing out jobs in the middle. So again, the question is, to what extent can skills repair this big convulsion being brought about by technology? The third force changing skills, in my view, is demography. As rich countries age and as consumption patterns change in rich countries, people consume more services than goods. The skills required to serve such a society in those countries as also around the world change. So whether you look at countries individually or look at the world as a whole, look at rich countries or poor countries, skill development is a big challenge. People like me understand this at a macro level, but we need people like you doing research at the micro level, trying to understand what is causing this loss of skills. How can people be skilled to meet the emerging needs of our changing society and economy? So over to you, Professor Kattumuri, to talk about the challenge of skill development, particularly from a South Asia perspective. You'll speak for about half an hour. Okay, thank you.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. I'm honored and sort of humbled with your very generous introduction, and thank you to Professor Mitra for having invited me to meet with all of you, and I would say have a discussion regarding this aspects of skills. What I'm going to do today is actually talk about it in the context of the developed economies. And the reason I would like to do this, and then of course we can have a discussion in the context of South Asia, which is an interest of this center and all of you doing relevant work in that regard. And my reason for choosing to talk about a developed economy context is because it's about we are in a global village, and I would say technology has made that possible, much more in the last, increasingly in the last 20 years, and exponentially in the last 10 years. And in a global village, it's for us then to think about how do these differences and imbalances, or what has happened in certain parts of the world or as developed economies, how can we then learn from these experiences, and especially for a country like India, which is large, which is democratic, and which is in its very important stage of development, learn from these so that we can fast track by kind of overcoming the hurdles of a developed model of the past and trying to create our own models of more sustainable growth. And in this context, not only in the context of education, skills, and development, but also in the case of infrastructure investment and a multiplicity of growth patterns, I think the world is changing so fast as well. For instance, what China has gone through, and the development path in China is about 20 years ahead of what India is right now. So we've got that also to understand and learn from China, and also learn so that we overcome some of the challenges that countries like China might be facing, and then we create a new development path so that we look at it for long-term prosperity or sustainability of its development. That's the reason for my kind of looking at some of these examples, and we can have discussions after that. So what I'm trying to do is, that's a rough outline. So just reviewing globalization briefly, and then giving the context of Brexit with respect to education differentials, wage differentials, intergenerational immobility, or the fact that mobility didn't exist, the productivity gap. So these are some indicators that I was able to find through review. So that I would talk about it in that context, and then we look at some of the issues through that are being addressed through technical and vocational education. I've taken some case studies from UK and something from Netherlands, and then we can discuss more about how can we re-image the challenges and opportunities of development, and we can have some reflections for South Asia. So firstly, just reviewing globalization. So what's happening currently is that there's a sort of resistance to globalization in the form that it was promoted in the 90s and 2000s. So because it's not just been 5 years, it's not just been 10 years, but because although these were promoted in the 90s and 2000s, but some of the people who have been left out from the benefits of globalization in the developed world sometimes goes back even to the 70s. So the problems of the 70s, which were trying to be addressed in the 90s through globalization, have failed, or there has been a failure of those being addressed even to date. And hence it's almost, this is the time when those sections of the population are speaking out, actually asking for a change, so which benefits people who've been left out. And that's the context, really. So the popular opinion articulated through democratic channels, that's what's being articulated. It seems to have been moved toward greater protection, and the reason to move toward that is because of the people who feel they've been left out from the benefits of globalization. So evidence, as we have seen, 2016 has been one of those years which we can call as a disruption or a toward correction sort of a scenario. So one of the evidences is Brexit, the other one is the sometimes called trumpet, and then the rise of far-right leaders in France and Germany. Also, we see some potential elections of far-right leaders, possibilities. We don't know yet, but there's a rise of far-right leaders in France and Germany as well. So what we're having here is done a little bit of an analysis of the scenarios of Brexit, and linking it with skills deficit, because what we think is that's one of the ways which has scope for trying to address some of these inequalities. So then we look specifically at how skills development and vocational training can be deployed to address some of these issues. And so these are key issues for all countries in the world, including developed countries. And then it provides foresight for countries in South Asia and other emerging economies to upscale policies for long-term growth and inclusive development. So if we look at this, there's some evidence of the perceptions of globalization. So what do we see here? This graph, if we look at this, I don't know if you can see this, there's a cross right at the top, which is China's middle class in terms of real income growth at various percentiles of global income distribution. This is 88 to 2008. And I thought the 2008 is a good marker because we couldn't get more recent data, but even so 2008 is a good marker because that is where we've seen lots of disruptions happening in the global economy. And there also, and that's a very clear indicator of what's going on, so that gives us the evidence that we're looking for. And this is, the source is Milanovic, which he produced in 2016. And if you look at the other cross at the bottom right, that's the US lower middle class. So the cross at the bottom right, that indicates the US lower middle class. So what does it show? It shows that the lack of income mobility along with the rise in skills premium as measured by wage difference between non-educated and college-educated worker. That's what it's showing. And it shows that the lack of income mobility along with the rise of skills premium between has led to a relative fall in the income growth of lower middle classes in the developed countries, which is the versus the developing ones. So what Milanovic has explored is how China's middle class has experienced tremendous income growth between 1988 and 2008, while the US lower middle class has been faced with stagnant wages. So what's happening is there's a skew in growth, which has led to loss of employment, lack of accrual of benefits in various societies, which has led to dissent against globalization. And this is also, now people have avenues through which they can express what they feel beyond media and other channels of of dissemination. So this is expressed through communication channels, which is such as social media. And people are looking at, so what's happening is, in order to address their own personal circumstances, people are looking to advance what is being termed as citizenship rent, or the intrinsic value of a country's citizenship, especially among developed countries. In a sense, when we look at this terminology, this is a new thing in the context of developed societies, which have promoted open markets, in, say, Europe or in the US, whereas to some extent the emerging economies, or if we take the context of Asia, there are mechanisms by which the countries or the economies and the governance structures have managed to protect the interests of their own people. So that's, you contrast that with regard to the open market economies. So in a way, there is now a throwback to citizens who have not benefited from globalization, looking to advance what is being now termed as citizenship rent. So that's what you see is happening as anti-immigration rhetoric. It's often targeted at protecting the privileges that the citizenship of a country offers. So in the context of Brexit, we are looking at these 4 indicators. So these are a couple of graphs about education differentials. I don't know how clear they are, but I'll just say what it is. So the top left of the graph indicates higher leave vote, fewer graduates. Okay, it's on the top left, and as you go toward the bottom right, it's higher leave vote, more graduates. So you see where it's concentrated much more on the top left, and the bottom graph there is so education, those who voted remain and those who voted leave. And what we see is about 68% of those with degrees voted to remain, whereas 32% with degrees voted to leave. So that kind of indicates the trend. So what's the context? So the role of vote for Brexit showed a demographic pattern. So older citizens were estimated to favor leave based on their own experiences. The ward-wise analysis of districts shows that the wards with the lower proportion of graduates had a higher vote to leave, and surveys have estimated that people with fewer formal qualifications were likely to vote leave. So that's again indicated over here. This is again district-wise share of 16 to 74-year-olds. The left side graph is with people with no qualifications in 2001, and the one of the right is district-wise share of leave voted in 2016 referendum. There again, the indication is that where you have percentage of people with lesser educational qualifications have voted more often to leave. So here we continue in the same context. So studies have shown that strong positive relationship between the education, skills, and training deprivation ranks of specific wards and the share of the leave vote. This shows that the vote share was not just linked to the level of college education, but also to the skills shortages of the population. So the next table I'm going to show, it's a big table, so don't worry about it. I'll just say what the context is. In this, it shows that areas with a stagnant construction, retail sector, and unchanging wages were more likely to vote leave. So this is the section of the population which has been struggling with lack of jobs and having had disenfranchised and are struggling with issues of poverty. So this is the graph that we are referring to, and that's indicated by significance indicated by the circles on the right. So here we look at some wage differentials. So while the data in the previous slides has led to oversimplification of the results of the vote and the level of education, but seen globally, there's been a large rise in the wage differentials between the skilled versus unskilled worker. So this graph on the right is for the US. It shows how the wages for an unskilled worker are actually lower than the 1964 levels. So the graph is getting, okay, you can look at the graph on the left. So if you look at where it started or at the beginning at 1964, if you follow the red line, so the actual wage in 2012 on the red line is lower than it was when it started in 64. That's the kind of process, phenomenon that's been happening. We'll take questions later.
Absolute wages or the percentage increment, the annual percentage increase, the x-axis?
So the x-axis is, what does it have?
Seems to be, basically what you said, seems to be the annual percentage increase based on the qualification that which you increase job market.
So it shows the wages for an unskilled worker.
Right.
So
the gap has widened over the years substantially.
It's not only the gap, but it's also the actual wage. I think that's the point I want to look at in this one. So the red line is less than high school. And the red line, those who have lower educational skills. So the income in 1964 was still higher than. So the income was high. So I'm just focusing on that one. Of course, the differentials and those other things and the gaps are also a different phenomenon. But the fact that at 64 and 2012, that again is something quite significant, that it should actually be the other way around, irrespective of educational qualifications, but it's going in a reverse direction, which is again one of the powerful arguments for some of the reactions in certain sections of the population.
It just gives credence to the fact that notion that in the 60s you could go with a high school diploma or less and get a lifelong job at GM or any of the big three automobile makers. Today,
you can't. That's right. So what we're saying with this is, again, we've seen the rise of activist slogans of 99% and Occupy movement. Some of these are also actually reflecting on similar kind of scenarios. So what we're saying is that the skill premium broadly shows how inequality has increased in the US and across global economies. There is an inherent positive value of inequality as an incentive alongside its potential social costs. So costs of inequality become more severe in the absence of economic and social, intra and intergenerational mobility. And that's actually a serious factor because all of us strive for upward economic and social mobility across generations, whereas these have also been some of the concerns. There is a constructive role to be played by policy in managing the levels of inequality in labor markets. So if we look at some of these intergenerational mobility aspects, so what we see there is, if you look at the top of the graph, the countries that are represented there are UK, US, Italy, and France. And what they're essentially showing is that there's a reduction in economic mobility, which adds to the distress caused by inequitable distribution of income. So that's why you see those 4 countries are at the top of this graph. They're facing, and those are the countries where there is a stronger rise of far-right political parties. So staying on the same theme of intergenerational mobility of income, Raj Shetty has been doing some work on this, and he's documented how the intergenerational mobility of income has been declining as seen in that figure, and the educational attainment is highly correlated with families. So that's the norm, where parental education and earnings are two strong predictors of children's ultimate educational attainment. The UK has more recently launched the Widening Participation Program, which makes higher education more accessible for students from all social classes, attempts to address cultural information barriers to higher education. These are some new initiatives are coming up, whereas greater awareness among policymakers to these issues is beginning to happen. So then if we look at the productivity gap, so I'm sorry, these graphs are not very clear. So essentially the second lowest graph, the second lowest line in the graph on the left, that represents UK. So what this shows is UK has been struggling with low levels of productivity, and that is productivity measured as GDP per hour worked or GDP per person employed. So the lowest levels of productivity is in the G7 countries other than Japan, and John Van Reenen has been making the statement that by Thursday lunchtime, the other countries have produced as much as it takes us, that is the UK, to produce by Friday afternoon when we knock off work. So that's the indicator of, or that's sort of a representation of the fact that the actual productivity gap or the levels of productivity seem to be lower in some of these countries. So this one, so this again, so we just highlight the UK angle here. So if we look at the region-wise breakdown of productivity levels in the UK, there is high disparity between regions. As you can see, those red parts are where it's less than 75, and the blue are where the productivity is high. So London remains the center for business, contributing highly to the economy. It brings in 30% of the total economy's taxes, more than other 37 cities combined. So London's economic output per person is more than double the average across the rest of the UK. And official figures showed that gross value added per head was higher in London than any other region, and double the level of the UK without London. So this also indicates how policies are skewing growth further. So people like us, some people may disagree with us, but people like us think that it should not be so skewed in favor of London alone and other parts of the UK getting left out. So the three main reasons being attributed to the productivity gap. So the investment in science, technology, and infrastructure has been lacking for some time. And in terms of management, smaller businesses often lack the skills required to promote efficiency, especially family-run businesses. So recent research by LSE shows that family businesses are now being used to protect wealth and act as a hindrance to intergenerational mobility. So then the focus is beginning to be made toward appropriate education, such as large-scale shortage of right skill sets required for manufacturing and production jobs. And a survey in 2014 shows that major skill shortages in engineering and IT industry. So 44% of employees said engineering, IT, and technical recruits did not meet their expected levels of skills. Employers were also increasingly dissatisfied with standards of literacy and numeracy among school leavers, and 76% of employers reported problems with recruiting senior engineers, and more than 50% reported that they could not find the employees they were looking for, and nearly 60% said that the shortage would be a threat to their business in the UK. So the deficit in technical and managerial skills demonstrates a serious gap in the education and training sector, and this is in the context of the UK. So this was a lecture that I organized for Dharman at the LSE in January. And some of the points he made are quite interesting, and obviously these are in the context of his own experience in Singapore. And so what he was saying was the traditional education system is not able to respond to the challenges of the tech-fueled growth of the 21st century, and what's needed is to question the purpose of educational system, constantly evolve curriculum to meet rapidly growing needs. Overemphasis on academic tertiary education is unnecessary, wasteful, and inequitable, and it needs to devote equal, if not more, focus on developing people with skills that match industry requirement. As the world population grows, more specialization of labor and targeted training is the future. These are primarily from what the lecture that he gave. He mentioned the paradox of skills. Employers need people with skills, not just qualifications. However, skills don't last long, as half-life of technology is much shorter. So education system needs to invest in regular skill upgradation. So change is needed, perhaps even for enhancing social skills as well, as evident in Singapore's current pivot away from PISA ranking led system to focus on holistic social development of children in schools. Hence, constant retraining is the future. So this is obviously the way, because I feel Singapore has a way of thinking ahead and thinking long term, and this is obviously because he also was Minister of Education before, and this is an aspect of which he's been thinking and trying to develop these policies and strategies for Singapore's own development. So now we look a little bit into technical and vocational education aspects. So there is a recognition of this gap in all countries. So both developed and developing nations are expanding technical and vocational programs. So this is a new, the latest budget of the UK. It adds what is called the T level to the existing school system. And what T level stands for is technical. So there's a measure of, so A levels, O levels, and there's the new thing called the T level, which stands for the technical levels. So Netherlands also has a network of vocational training institutions. Singapore has its model with Polytechnic, Skills Future, and a responsive university system offers a model. So US and UK have also promoted apprenticeships as a way to increase skills training directly with employers. So India, of course, I think Dipender can tell us more about it, has been investing in major Skill India program to train about 40 million people. So just briefly on UK's T-level and national colleges, they were announced in the 2017 spring budget. It's streamlining existing system with 15 qualifications to come up in 2019. And these sectors include catering, hospitality, construction, social care, engineering, and manufacturing. And the government will invest 500 million per year in setting up program aimed at increasing the number of hours student trained by 50%. It also includes 3 months work placement to promote culture of apprenticeship and on-the-job training. It aims to reduce negative stigma associated with vocational training and puts it on par with academic qualifications. So the government is setting up and promoting national colleges through provision of maintenance loans, and these would and national colleges are being set up to address specific skill shortages in UK while attempting to promote regionally balanced growth. And the regionally balanced growth that is being considered is the high-speed rail, the nuclear energy hubs, onshore oil and gas, digital skills, creative and cultural industry. So these are some of the future plans being developed in the UK. If we look at the Netherlands model, it has a network of 70 vocational education and training colleges, which is crucial to the Dutch economy. 40% of Dutch labor force have completed a vocational training course. Netherlands government invests 2.6 billion euro per year, 12% of educational spend in VET system. Now this is obviously much higher than what UK is spending, and the courses are diverse in duration and subject matter. They are offered in technology, economics, personal social services, healthcare, adult education, agriculture, and food technology. And the specialized courses for industry-specific requirements also available, such as graphic art and design, butchery, house painting, future making, furniture making, fishing, or shipping and transport. And the duration ranges from 6 months to 4 years at different levels of training. Students from the age of 16 can choose between a school-based learning route or a work-based route. Both routes involve practical or on-the-job training. Now, I find the reason I picked on the Dutch model is because of what happened in the recent election. So it was pretty much breaking the trend of the rise of the far right, because we saw the election, although there was a far right Party for Freedom by the populist Geert Wilders, he seemed to ride a high wave, but actually in the results, the former Prime Minister won in the elections of March 27. And for me, that was also an indication where we were seeing what was happening in other parts of the world, that this was reversing the trend a little bit, in the sense that perhaps there is a greater sustainable and a more equitable distribution among the population in Netherlands, and perhaps that's where they were able to decide the way they did. So that was one reason for looking at the case of Netherlands. So what we see here is infrastructure for vocational training is built with an additional 650 square meters of non-academic training space. It amounts to an investment of more than 1.5 million per school. And the VET maintain close relations with labor market and obtain feedback on quality and content of course, which ensures regular upgrading. So it ensures a good updated match between skills, demand, and supply. So then we look at the Singapore's focus on vocational training, which has initiated major investments in its skills future. It's aimed at investing in people throughout their lives. It's experimenting with new forms of learning, such as online, hybrid, flipped classrooms, bit-sized learning at the workplace, in the community, or at home. And these models work for Singapore's growth, but not easily replicable in other countries, simply because scalability over larger areas and populations is not easy, but also the fact that there are rural-urban divides in other parts of in other countries. However, there are important learning to be gained from Singapore's model, which is the close industry relations, which are crucial to a successful vocational training system. New formats of learning are going to be important in the future. Private providers such as you've got Coursera, Udemy, and other large-scale platforms have a major role to play. Work to empower people to be aware of new skill requirements and pathways to gain them. Large-scale public investment in education provision, including training of teachers. I was at an event by the Education Minister on Friday where he spoke on what the Singapore government is thinking on 3 points, which is internationalization, enterprise, and inclusivity. So in order to stay ahead of and keep their growth in an accelerated mode, they're now going to focus on 3 aspects, which is on internationalizing their workforce and then encouraging more of entrepreneurship. And the inclusivity aspect is what they are focusing on with respect to skills and training in Singapore. So I'll finish with this, which I'm saying is reimaging challenges and opportunities of globalization. So in summary, the key lessons from 2016 are that models of growth that take every citizen along with equal opportunities and equitable distribution of resources are as essential for sustainable growth. Capital bias growth has caused people to be left behind. So the policies need to re-emphasize capital investment growth focus and enable inclusive growth through skills training, upgrade, and empowerment. So there's a recent focus of LSE Growth Commission recommendations for the UK economy, which recommends jobs and skills. So technology has helped create new platforms that make skilling necessary and easier than ever before. And reimagining education and skills training regularly is essential to meet advancements and opportunities of technological advancements in order to enhance growth and development that can include all. Now, I'd just like to just reflect on the technology angle and the artificial intelligence. I'm more of an optimist when it comes to technology, in the sense that I'm part of the IT revolution in India, and my guru, as I would say, was called grandfather of computer science in India, who was working on theoretic computer science maybe 60 odd years ago, before India had any clue about where the IT would take it. It has sort of brought in a larger group of the, say, lower middle class sections of Indian population, has enabled their economic upward mobility. So I do believe, so in a way, if I touch upon one phrase that is often used with statistics, which is also my background, statistics is said as lies, damn lies, and statistics. That was the definition of statistics. But my response to that statement, even when I was an undergrad student, was the tool is not the problem. It's the person who uses the tool is the problem. So it's about how do we enable what we create, including artificial intelligence, because technology, artificial intelligence, all these things are creations of human beings to enhance the quality of our life. But how do we manage that? We have a lot of technology now, but it's only increased the stress on our lives. But it's about how do we govern, how do we manage, and how do we make this work for us is not in the hands of machines and robots, but it's in the hands of human beings. I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kattumuri, for a wonderful exposition. Very impressive how you started from the large canvas political economy issues and linked that to people left behind, their anxieties, concerns, and then again linked that to skill shortage and skill development. And you stuck to time, wonderful. So we're now open for discussion, questions, comments. Yes, Dipagya.
Thank you. That was a very wonderful presentation. I just had a query of sorts. You highlighted the importance of vocational training, especially in the UK and Netherlands, etc. From what little I know of the Indian experience, we have polytechnics, ITIs, etc. But the prospect of jobs for those candidates is pretty dismal, to say the least, and I think Dipendra would know better than me. So do you think that this would solve the problem in the longer run of inclusive growth, inclusive development, or do you think that there must be some public policy initiative where the government has to force the corporates to go and hire a percentage of what they hire every year from these ITIs? And what is the situation in the UK? Is it the same or is it something better? That's all.
So just, in the UK, it's over the decades. I think what's happened is the polytechniques have been converted into universities. So, for example, University of Westminster was a polytechnic before, but whereas it's a university now. But I think where the UK has failed in, or for a few decades, which I think I felt that even 20 years ago when I first moved to the UK, was while it had been a leader in science and technology in the past, it failed to invest in science and technology. It had to sustain that investment as well as a wider base of skills development among its people in order to reintroduce or renew the skills or find ways of engaging with people who had lost jobs due to different forms of industrialization. Those things were neglected, and that's what is being evident in these countries. But in India, it's a whole different story altogether. And I think in India, I see this as we are at a stage where we have huge amounts of opportunity. So the fastest growing economy in the world, it's a cliche, which is fine. But if we think about what our development path is, I see the future, the next 20 years are extremely crucial for us. And some of us are part of the system in India where things were slow. We've kind of have seen the Hindu rate of growth, but that is past. That's kind of history. So these next 20 years, what we do, yes, if there were failures in these institutions which existed, that's again the past. So now we have an opportunity. How do we make it inclusive? We cannot say they have to be forced into, but we have to find ways by which we enable our own people to be employable. So even our education system, the curriculum we taught, some of us have struggled with that, trying to change the curriculum, which could not happen. But there's a lot going on at the same time. At the same time, we have a challenge that we are a large country, we are a diverse country, we have a huge population, and that's where we need to introduce, you know, better policies, or we have to implement those policies. We have a lot of policies on paper, but we have to implement them more effectively. That's what we need to be thinking about. The ITIs exist, but perhaps the ITIs have to be reformed, the curriculum have to be improved. One of the things here is also looking at the demand and supply. There has to be a constant communication between the demand and supply. Not that we force somebody to take on a quota of people, but it's about how do we make the people who are being turned out to be employable, who are willing to be taken, you know. They should be willing to take them, which means you have to fix the problem as well. So we have to do multiple things simultaneously. And sometimes people can, the good things that are happening is even in rural areas, there is the SEZ, there's a lot going on there. So people who were in agricultural industry before are now able to access jobs in the neighborhood because there's the golden quadrangle, there's the road, these kind of things happening. So there are more opportunities, but lots more needs to be done simply because we are a large country with large challenges.
Professor Mitra?
I join Dr. Subbarao in welcoming you to ISAS. What you don't know, and you should, and all of you should know, is that we have a hidden agenda, which is why you are here. The hidden agenda is this. This institute has 3 major concentrations: foreign policy, economy, and governance. I have, over the last 2 years, pushed skills development as a new area because I think it connects all 3. Because India and China are competitors, and we have believed in this institute that India and South Asia have to look at skills development as one area which needs attention in order to catch up. And under the leadership of Dr. Dipendra Singh Randhawa, we are going ahead. We are going to have our own international workshop on skills development. That's the context. In that context, let me ask you 2 questions. You gave, one of your earlier statements was that every country has to develop a model of sustainable growth, which should be its own model. Immediately after that, you said that China is 20 years ahead of India. It gives the impression that, like in the Olympic, there is one race, and you run fast or run slowly, and you fall behind. So the 2 sentences appear to be contradicting one another. The second one is a more serious question. That's also a question that I have for Dr. Dipendra, because he has been doing field work on the ITIs. And I come from Odisha, and I have experience of ITIs, and that connects to the previous question of Dr. Diparko. ITIs produce graduates that are unemployable. They sit there bribing government officers to get jobs as clerks. Not they, but their parents. It shows to me the failure of supply-side development programs. You want skills? Build an ITI, and it produces graduates. It will start off. But you see, if there is no demand for shoes, then expensive skill to shoe repair will not work. That, I think, is a fundamental flaw in this kind of thinking. That learn from Singapore, they develop skills, so you develop skills, not realizing there is no demand. The even bigger flaw is the assumption that development would come to your doorstep. You have nothing to do. It will be delivered to you. People don't realize that you can't make omelets without breaking a few heads. poverty, inequality are not so bad. They are the sharp whip that makes you get on a bicycle and go where the jobs are. What is this soft, nice development model is giving a false sense of security that you are a citizen, you have nothing to do, it will be delivered to your doorstep, and we will somehow produce jobs. First, get this useless ITI training. This is exactly why I want some fundamental thinking in this institute, and that's why I've been after Dipinder from the day he came to set up this workshop so that we can think about something really theoretically new and riveting.
That's very interesting. Thank you, because I think so I've not touched. Okay, the contradiction about those two statements. I get your point, but what I was meaning was not about comparable as to what China did and what India did, but it's about the in their own way. So if you look at what China can do now in terms of its prosperity, India's capability of its growth is still far behind. It's only in that sense of comparison, not in the sense of that we should follow the model of China. So in a sense, I would think that we should design our own models, and by looking at what others have done, to not make the mistakes others have done. That's the advantage that India has, because the next 20 years are crucial and important, and we have to design our own, taking good lessons but creating our own model. So that's my clarification. And in terms of ITI, I just think, and this is an unqualified statement because I've not either looked at what ITIs are doing or where they are now. I'm aware that ITIs exist, so it's right that we should be looking at these, because I also think that we should create new things but also not waste the infrastructure that we already have. So I also believe that existing public sector infrastructure has to be tried to, again, it could be more expensive to do that, but on the other side, I hate waste. And so it's about, is there a balance between the two? And I'm only raising questions here. I'm not giving answers, because as you said, it's something we have to think about, and we have to think about together, you know? So in a sense, for example, say, let me take, we have a bank, you know, person who can manage the banking sector. So it's like, if I go to the state bank, 10 years ago, I just felt I wanted to open an account with the state bank, but the process was so difficult that I went to the nearest different bank and opened an account. But why did I want to go to state bank? Because I felt this is the largest public sector bank in the country, and it provides jobs for so many people. So I want to support the public sector thing. But also my motivation is that how can we reform the public sector institutions and make them their performance, you know, improve the performance of these institutions, because we already have the infrastructure. So, but today, I think State Bank has done hugely, you know, it's really progressed extremely well in the last 10 years. It has benefited hugely from the 2008 crisis in the West. For example, in the UK, I'm just talking only in the context of how it benefited in the UK. It grew from 2 branches to like 8 branches because people were confused about what was happening in the world, and they were looking for a safe option, and they would go into something which was totally unknown to them, walk in the door and try to find better systems. So that's a different story. But the point is about reforms of existing infrastructure is one aspect. I'm not saying it's the only aspect. Or if we take about, yes, it's more expensive to reform existing infrastructure than to build new infrastructure, maybe so. That's what we need to sit and evaluate. That's what we need to try to understand and decide what's the best way. I don't mean we should not get rid of things which are, you know, if they are sick institutions and that nothing can be done to reform them, then maybe so. But if there are institutions they can be reformed at a lesser investment than new institutions, we should think about reforming them. So I'm just thinking aloud here. Okay. Where necessary, we should bring in totally new institutions with new. So, for example, if we look at education, 10 years ago there was this attitude against private sector institutions. But that attitude is changing now. And if private sector institutions can produce high standard, there is a challenge that private institutions have, because the culture in India is that you go to the top well-known public sector educational institutions for, it gives you that profile, the quality or the standard. In some ways that's still believed. And so there is a challenge, and I know by interacting with both the public and private sector institutions that private sector institutions may be willing to attract, but younger people very rarely go into, or people who want a career in academics rarely go directly to the private sector institutions. Whereas it will take some time to change. It can change and it will change. And so these kind of challenges still exist in different parts of India. Now, ITIs, I'll just give an example of something I thought about when I was doing a totally different study in just off Bangalore, outskirts of Bangalore. I go to a village, I'm trying to look at the adaptation to climate issues, and I see young people, 15 to 24-year-olds, just wandering in the village, hanging around in the village. And so I wondered, because I'm interested in their future, their career, what do they do with their lives? And so I just did a focus group. So it was an additional thing beyond what I was actually there for surveying. And the focus group, you have these young people who've completed 10th standard, who've finished graduation, some done ITIs, but have no jobs and are just standing around in the village. They do not want to go to the cities. They're in the outskirts of Bangalore. Some of them had migrated, spent short amounts of time in Bangalore, but they do not want to go. So in this, I did an op-ed, which I wouldn't have used the title, but you can never determine what titles newspapers use. So they used the title "Help Indians Live in the Villages." That's not the title I chose. But what I was trying to say in that article is, how can we make these young people employable within the context of where they want to be? And in that context, yes, they have done various things there. How can we not? So I was reflecting on the whole IT revolution, which was an urban phenomenon in the 80s and 90s. So what I was trying to kind of think is, how can we take some of these jobs? Now technology exists that it doesn't have to be only the young people sitting in Bangalore who do the outsourcing. But of course, before that, we have to fix a lot of infrastructure. There has to be better electricity. There has to be more consistent power. So there's so many indicators that we need to work on. But then how do we think? So there are social enterprise organizations. Then because I was thinking about this, I was finding information about private and social enterprise initiatives, which are kind of trying to do what I was suggesting. After I'd written that, I found things like that happening. But many of these things are happening in a small scale way. But again, what I'm saying is, these have to be thought through more, which is, I think, why what you're initiating or trying to do is very important.
Thank you. Ayushi. Ayushi is studying MA?
Yes, I'm doing my master's in economics at NUS.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful talk. So I had just one question. You had spoken about addressing skill shortages in one of your slides. So we do recognize this gap that exists between education and skill development, and then some work is being done, which is rather localized and slow. So how, what is your opinion on how we could accelerate this reduction in gap between education and skill development?
You must write a term paper on that.
That's right. Is that your dissertation topic? So let me try and understand your question. You're saying there are lots of things being done at a small scale, and how can that be scaled up?
We do recognize that a change in curriculum is required. We do recognize that there exists a gap, and there are small steps to be taken. But this whole gap between skill and education is so wide how do you see this being addressed in future? Like, instead of just the small steps being taken, and not just in developed countries, but most importantly in developing countries where the requirement for this is more.
So I think this is not a new issue. So when I was teaching, say, let me talk about my students of the 80s and 90s in Madras, computer science and statistics, the push from the parents is you have to do medicine or engineering or science, yeah? And so half the class, intelligent young people, but hate statistics and computer science. So, but what was required was, so the pattern of employment was you needed a degree. This is again a context of the population. So you needed a degree or a master's to get a job. That's the screening system that the institution uses. But people also have their fundamental ability, which comes through a combination of factors from education in different forms. Education is sometimes enabling you to operate in a certain way, think in a certain way. You cannot, as an educationist, I also hold the view that classroom teaching alone does not give you everything that you need, because it's a multiplicity of components, okay? So the question you're asking more, that's my philosophy, but the question you're asking is about job skills, right? So these are making them employable with the skills that are required. There, I think the balance has to be between constantly upgrading demand and supply, whether it is at a small scale, individual initiatives. But by the way, lot of social entrepreneurship initiatives are happening across India, and smaller scale institutions are going into the villages and trying to enable these kind of employability. And it's not just rural, it's also an urban phenomenon. Even 10 years ago, some of us used to have this discussion about the education system was not giving the substance that the students required to actually get them the kind of jobs that they need. But then young people these days have other modes of, learning, right? The world is more open, so younger people are more knowledgeable, more access to multiple ways of learning. This is what I mean by saying, when we thought about IT as something that opens the world, so knowledge is open. So you have multiple ways of learning too, and you have to combine all these methods: self-learning, social entrepreneurships at a local level, state policies at the national or state level. You have to have a combination of factors, but all through what it is, it's demand and supply. Somewhere that has to coincide with each other. I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm just trying to think of...
But that question in some sense is unanswerable, right? When we find the answer, we would have reached nirvana. Yes, ma'am, that young lady there. Which part of NUS are you from?
I'm not from NUS, I'm a reporter actually.
Okay.
So I wanted to bring this discussion of skills into the current context. As Prime Minister Modi emphasizes a lot of specific sectors, that he wants to prioritize infrastructure, sanitation, and as the threat of H-1B visa reform starts to come into play, that could reduce the amount of Indian skilled workers going stateside. What sectors do you see, what sectors need the most skills in India right now? Is it linked to Modi's reform agenda, or do you see, a new set of sectors that may have always needed more people or, fresh talent? Yeah, I'm not sure if this falls in your area of research,
well,
but it can be a question for both of you.
Sure. Do you want to say something?
Do I want to say something? I think she asked you, but what I want to say is that government should not be in the business of picking winners. Across countries over the last 100 years, we've seen of development history that we should leave what specific skills to the market forces. So Prime Minister Modi, I don't think, should be sitting in Delhi and deciding that these are the skills required for the next 5 years. He should let market forces determine that. And the challenge for India, or indeed for countries across South Asia, is to build that link between market forces, which are giving information about skills required currently and for the next 5 years, and the training establishments, such as the ITIs, IITs, polytechnics. And it's not preparing people for skills at a point of time, but preparing people to learn skills all the time. You know, it's not giving them you give them a specific skill, but you also give them a skill to keep upgrading their skills. I think that's very important. I don't think the government should be picking specific sector. Well, I don't know. You know, I've not dirtied my hands with the nitty-gritty of India, but I live in India part-time, and you can't get a plumber who knows his job. You can't get a carpenter, so you need those basic skills as well as high-end skills. Okay, so I think India needs skills across the spectrum and indeed beyond the spectrum.
By the way, the plumbers earn more than academics do in London. Some
Yes.
plumbers.
Yeah, they do, in fact. And it's surprising, but I live in Hyderabad, in Andhra Pradesh, and all the plumbers are from Orissa. So it's that whether there is some network effect in skill training is something that we need to investigate. That they see some people from the village have gone and learned plumbing, and they're making good in Chennai and Hyderabad and Delhi, and more people join that. So, and people from Kerala who earn skills have all gone to the Middle East. So it's difficult to get skills within Kerala now. So I think one of the things we need to understand apart from skilling is to find out what network effects play and what migration patterns come into play in skill distribution. Dipinder.
So I agree with Dr. Subbarao on the general principle of markets also have to determine. But at the same time, again, this aspect has to be the demand and supply. So that's what he's saying as market forces. At the same time, what happens is when there are priorities for development that are being determined by the policies, those also determine where the opportunities are going to grow, and that's also a way of focusing on the necessary skills. So if we are talking about renewables, if we are talking about investment in infrastructure, which these are the priorities for India, right? If we think about what are the most important things that are going to happen in India is investment in infrastructure, and investment in a green growth pattern, in a sustainable thing, and also education and skills. These are, I would think, if I had to randomly pick 3 top priorities for India, I would say these are some of those priorities. And accordingly, of course, and markets are smart. They know what is priority, and these policies are also determined by that. So once the policies, so there's the smart cities policies, or they're being introduced, there's of course all the other related aspects that come into these priorities. So, and those drive what happens in the markets, as well as that's where the demand and supply has to be.
The iteration between markets and institutions. Dipinder?
I have a couple of comments. With Dr. Subbarao's permission, may I take a few minutes?
Sure.
The first one is a response to, I think, a very important question the young lady asked earlier about the relationship between education and skills. I'd like to get your perspective on this. My brief answer to that is India has failed its youth and citizenry abysmally in both education and in health. Education, the allocation to education is amongst the lowest in the developing world. Of that, a disproportionate amount goes to institutes of higher education where you train world-class, globally competitive people, but at the primary and the secondary school surveys at set level and high school. This is incidentally information that's brought out by Pratham, the annual survey of education, which is replicated in the economic survey, the most authoritative document brought out. A disproportionate number of kids in class 8 are unable to read at 5, grade 5. A disproportionate, overwhelming majority at 5 are unable to read below 2. Coupled with that, this is, again, on the health front, the only country where with growth in income, and substantial growth has been very impressive, cognitive abilities have been stagnant, even amongst a rising middle class. And that is profoundly disturbing in the sense that, once by the age of 5 you don't pick up, the odds are dramatically stacked against you. It's extremely difficult. So the issue of skills development, which is intimately related to cognitive abilities, becomes a really moot point. I mean, what are we training people for, and how well can we equip them? Having said that, there's a large number of counterexamples. There are a lot of oases of excellence. The differences across states, as we discussed, are quite dramatic. The South is virtually a different country, as is parts of West, compared to the North and the Northwestern parts of India. So I'd just like to get your observations later. But if I may be a devil's advocate for a moment, I want to turn to the first part of your presentation when you're talking about the developed world. There's a large amount of literature that's come out in recent times talking about increasing inequality and what that's doing to both social stability and the global fabric, and to what extent that's leading to the rise of the far right. This is an argument that comes out from the neoclassical side. One thing that has changed dramatically in the world over the last 30 years, starting in the 80s, is an unequal relationship between the power the owners of capital wield and the power the owners of labor wield. And that is being shown again very significantly in secular changes in income and the amount of GDP which is held by owners of capital and power, and the ability to relocate production. To some extent, this makes the entire point about skills development and so on and so forth a myth. I mean, the first time I heard this was during Clinton's tenure. The US was doing remarkably well. By the late 90s, Detroit started going down. The center of gravity had shifted to Japan, and then, of course, to Germany has always been very solid, and then to Korea. And the point was, somebody in the mid-40s, what on earth are you going to train them or retrain them for? And just to bolster that argument, the chief technology officer, I recall hearing this quite recently of Siemens, this premier engineering company, said the half-life or the life of new technologies, it was about 15 years in the 1980s. Today is hovering around 5 years, with new technologies coming up in production and in process and supply chain and so forth. So that substantially has reduced the shelf life of productively deploying the new skills you've acquired as well. So I just want to get your viewpoint. But more pertinently, I mean, one of the things that you do is you try to look for the success story that we were discussing earlier. To me, the most remarkable case, a few cases are Germany, Switzerland, and South Korea. And the German and the Swiss model, which is emulated, there's nothing mysterious about it. One is that there's this very close coordination between labor, industry, and government. So kids coming out and beyond the primary school level, they already get screened. And coupled with the fact that there aren't any substantial differences in income earning prospects between whether you go into the vocational route or the university route, there isn't that much of angst coming out if the child winds up in the vocational side. But having said that, again, evidence from India and the little bit that I've seen, including at the ITI level, shows where the ITIs with the skills trainers are talking to industry, you find substantially productive results. I noticed this I think I mentioned to you in Himachal Place, in a small place. But as Dr. Subbarao pointed out, you're talking in a vacuum. If the government believes it can train or identify the winners, then what do you train for in areas where there's no investment? So skills is just part of the larger setup. It's not a magic bullet or anything. there are complementary policies. I mean, without jobs, I don't have the foggiest idea what skills are going to be. Just to give you another example, in the midst of crisis, for instance, Intel was considering several years ago setting up $1 billion plant. It's going to become multi-billion. And they looked at a number of countries, India, Thailand. They eventually settled for Vietnam. And this was in a district which didn't have any logistical advantage or proximity to the port. It was simply because, despite being a communist country, they had substantially streamlined investment procedures, the one window clearance, and that won out over other competing areas. So, I'm sorry, I've taken an awfully long time. Your response I wanted to get to you was, to what extent do you believe skills can be viewed productively in the manner in which they're being treated in India, and to what extent complementary and other policies are essential?
So there's a lot packed in there, dependent, and some of it is important because they come from your own research, and so those are valuable comments. So only response I would give is, it connects with what Professor Mitra said, is there are aspects of governance as well. It's not skills alone, but for this, some of the aspects are aspects of governance. They kind of are intricately involved with how governance reacts to this. And the questions you mentioned about how do you reskill people in their 40s, these are difficult questions. And just off the top of my head, I mean, can you train people technology? I used to teach a professor of computer science in her late 50s to actually write, those days you didn't have ready-made SPSS, but you had to have, like, you used BASIC and you had to use those things.
Punch cards.
Yeah, and I used to try to train her to do that, because while she knew how the machine worked, she couldn't use a word processing program. So what I'm saying is, I'm just saying that as a tongue-in-cheek comment, that it's possible to train people in different ways. But being more realistic about the question is, so if I take the case of Detroit, people who have lost jobs, I would raise a question to that instead of answering that question. Is one of the problems, and I'm just thinking aloud here because I'm among friends, is that one of the problems that the West has is an aging population, and there's a huge care deficit of the elderly. It's not very difficult for people in their 40s to be able to be skilled into those kind of jobs where they meet gap. But again, the fundamental aspect is demand and supply, and what is the requirement, and identifying what is doable. So that's something that has to be determined and decided locally. I'm just making a comment, just trying to think about it now. Before I would have tried to think about it, but decided I didn't need to find an answer, but I'm just trying to think about possible answers right now. That's one aspect of it, but more importantly, it's governance. Having said that, if I just think about India, for instance, actually quite a lot has happened in the last 10 years. Then, of course, there is the challenge of investment, having the finances to invest for the size or in the way that is required. There are big problems. But if we look at some of the good things that have happened, they're not just 4 IITs, which were there 20 years ago, or there are IITs in several smaller cities as well. These are premier institutions. And similarly, there are quite a lot of other things happening. And if we think about policy, so earlier, the only policy that existed even till 20 years ago was midday meal scheme, which expanded from one state to across the country. But the fact that right to education was introduced is also a step forward. So several things have happened, but at the same time, India needs financial investment. It needs to invest more because our needs are more. So that's where the governance structures also are actually imbibed into these things. So those are just a few comments, no answers.
Any other questions, comments?
I just want to share.
Yes.
Thank you for the wonderful discussion. It's really enlightening. I have worked in skills sector for a couple of years in India, and I have realized that government has literally taken a proactive measures at their end. As just now, you mentioned that IITs have been expanded, and the government has started Skill India mission, and at the same time, Make in India initiative. There's no dearth of CSR companies who are ready to invest in capacity building initiative. But I think from my own experience, I feel that there is a huge gap at the end of what new skills are needed by the people, what new requirements are for the from the company side. If we can undertake some research initiatives at that end, it would definitely change the whole skill scenario in India, especially in India. And also at the same time, there is based on the new skill requirement, if we can develop content and train our trainers for conducting trainings in this regard. So that is my comment and a request if anyone can initiate capacity building mapping exercise in India.
Thank you.
It's a comment.
No,
so.
thank you very much for that comment. You're very right that there has to be a link between what skills the market requires and the skills that people are being trained for in these training institutions. But I'm also a believer in market forces, in response to that question that lady from the media asked earlier. When Maruti first came to India in the 1980s, there was the first wave of car explosion in India. Maruti had authorized workshops across the country, and they trained people in repairing or maintaining Maruti cars. But within 2 years, Maruti repair workshops mushroomed across the country, unauthorized. Okay? And they were competing with the authorized workshops. And they were as good in quality, and at probably 1/5 the price. Nobody told them that there is a demand for this. Somehow the market forces work. People realize that here is a demand for car maintenance, and across the country, unauthorized Maruti workshops came with trained people who, I don't know whether you call them trained, they didn't have a certificate, but they could attend to Maruti maintenance. So I think, while what you say is important, market is a great disseminator of knowledge and information. I think the institutions must catch that. The problem in India, India is a country that I know, the problem in India is that our training institutions are not equipped to catch those signals and train people.
Yeah, that's why somewhere we need to do a skill mapping kind of an
Yes, skill mapping, yes. Yeah, but I contest your statement that corporates with the CSR are very enthusiastic about imparting skills. CSR is a necessary evil that they're doing because it's mandated by the company law. But I don't think that they see a profit model in skilling people. And private sector does not, as a business model, skill people because they'll run away with the skills. Okay, you need a public-private partnership. Okay. So once again, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank Professor Ruth Kattumuri for a wonderful, comprehensive lecture. And I'm impressed by how you went from the large canvas issues, macroeconomy, globalization, to the very nitty-gritty of street-level skills and skill impartation. So thank you very much. We do hope that you will come back here and we will have continued association between LSC and ISAS, the India Observatory, of which you are the co-director, and our activities here in ISAS. As a token of our appreciation, I now request our director to present to you 2 wonderful books that you can read on your flight home. Okay.
We are very grateful for getting us started until we have our own workshop. I am very pleased to offer you 2 books. One is on energy in South Asia.
Thank you very much.
The other, pre-modern India, connectivity of the classical and modern in terms of political theory. That's my book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now now we go for tea?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Jordan, thank you very much for organizing
Tell me
the
a
talk.
little about the India Observatory. It is it's a center by itself?